Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
When my ex-husband's new wife showed up at my door demanding my late father's estate, her smirk told me she thought she'd already won. What she didn't know was that I had a secret weapon, my lawyer, who walked in just in time to flip her plan on its head. What followed was a series of revelations, betrayals, and the kind of justice that tastes sweeter than revenge. Saturday mornings are supposed to be peaceful, a chance to ease into the weekend with coffee and quiet. That's what I had planned until the knock at my door shattered the stillness. It wasn't a friendly knock. It was the kind that carried entitlement, like the person on the other side thought the world owed them something. When I opened the door, there stood Amanda, my ex-husband Tim's new wife. She looked every bit as overdone as I remembered, with her perfectly styled hair, designer sunglasses perched on her head, and a smug smile that made me want to slam the door shut again. Behind her, Tim stood awkwardly, hands in his pockets, avoiding my eyes. Amanda wasted no time. "We're here for our rightful share of your father's estate," she declared, her voice dripping with confidence. "Move out immediately. We've already spoken to a lawyer, and everything's being handled." She waved a manicured hand toward my house like it was a showroom she'd already claimed. For a moment, I was too stunned to speak. My father had passed away only 3 months ago, leaving everything to me, his only child. The house, the land, his modest savings. It was all mine, and I had the paperwork to prove it. Tim and I had been divorced for 2 years, and I thought I'd seen the last of his entitled nonsense. Clearly, I'd underestimated his new wife's audacity. I took a slow breath, steadying the anger bubbling inside me. "Oh," I said, raising an eyebrow. "That's interesting. Why don't you both come in? I'd love to hear more about this so-called claim." Amanda smirked, mistaking my calmness for submission, and stepped inside. Her heels clicked against the hardwood floor like a countdown to chaos. Tim followed reluctantly, barely glancing at me as he muttered, "This isn't personal. It's just business. Business. Right?" I swallowed a bitter laugh and gestured for them to sit in the living room. Amanda perched on the edge of the couch, looking around like she was already planning renovations, while Tim slouched beside her, his discomfort evident. "Let's hear it," I said, folding my arms and leaning against the doorway. "What makes you think you have a claim to my father's estate?" Amanda's smile widened, and she launched into a rehearsed spiel. "When your father passed, you were still married to Tim, which means any inheritance you receive during that time is community property. By law, Tim has a right to half of it, and as his wife, I'm here to make sure it's handled appropriately." The sheer audacity of her words left me speechless for a moment. Community property? Was she serious? Tim and I had divorced long before my father's passing, and even if we hadn't, my dad's will left no room for debate. But Amanda was clearly banking on intimidation, or ignorance, to get what she wanted. "Fascinating," I said finally, keeping my voice as neutral as I could. "I wasn't aware you'd become a legal expert overnight." Amanda's smirk faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly. "We've consulted a lawyer," she said confidently. "This isn't up for debate. Pack your things and vacate the property. It's time to hand over what's rightfully ours." I couldn't help but laugh at that. A sharp, incredulous laugh that made Amanda bristle. "Rightfully yours?" I repeated. "You do realize this was my father's home, don't you? A man you never even met? And you think you're entitled to his life's work?" Amanda's face darkened, but before she could respond, Tim finally spoke up. "Look, we're just trying to make this fair," he said, his tone more measured. "We don't want to fight. Just what's owed." I stared at him, incredulous. "Fair," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "You think fairness is showing up at my door, demanding my father's estate like it's some prize you've earned?" Tim looked away, his cheeks flushing. Amanda, however, didn't back down. "You can be as dramatic as you want," she said coolly. "But it doesn't change the facts. You'll be hearing from our lawyers soon." For a moment, I considered throwing them out right then and there. But a better idea formed in my mind, one that would ensure they couldn't weasel their way into anything that wasn't theirs. "I'm looking forward to it," I said, smiling sweetly. "But before you waste your time, or mine, I'd love to introduce you to someone who might have a different take on your facts." Just then a knock sounded at the door. Perfect timing. "That'll be my lawyer," I said, watching Amanda's smirk fade as she realized she might not have the upper hand after all. Amanda strutted through my house as if it were already hers. Her heels clicked on the hardwood floor, each step dripping with arrogance. She barely glanced at the family photos on the walls or the heirlooms carefully displayed on shelves. pieces of my father's life and legacy. To her, they were just items to be cataloged and claimed. Behind her, Tim shuffled in, his shoulders hunched and his gaze firmly fixed on the floor. "Coffee," I offered, keeping my tone light and casual. Amanda gave me a dismissive wave, her manicured nails flashing in the sunlight pouring through the window. "No, thank you," she said curtly. "Let's just get to the point. This house, the land, it all belongs to Tim now. And as his wife, I'll be managing things from here on out." I raised an eyebrow, pretending to be intrigued. "That's quite a claim," I said, folding my arms. "I'm curious to know how you arrived at that conclusion." Amanda crossed her arms, her sharp smile faltering for just a moment before she recovered. "It's simple," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "Tim was your husband when your father passed. By law, any inheritance you receive during your marriage is community property. That gives him a claim to the estate, and as his wife, I have every right to ensure it's handled properly." I stared at her, fighting the urge to burst out laughing. Her confidence was astounding, especially considering how wrong she was. "Community property, you say?" I asked, tilting my head. "Interesting. Go on." Amanda mistook my feigned interest for confusion, and her smile widened. "It's not that complicated," she said, as though she were explaining something to a child. "You were married when your father died, which ties Tim to the estate. We've already consulted a lawyer, and they assured us we're well within our rights to demand control of the property." I nodded slowly, tapping my chin as if I were processing this newfound information. "I see," I said thoughtfully. "And you're sure about this? Your lawyer must be very confident." "Absolutely," Amanda replied, her smirk returning full force. "We've done our homework. You might as well start packing now. It'll save everyone a lot of time and trouble." Tim shifted uncomfortably, finally breaking his silence. "Look, we're not trying to make this harder than it has to be," he mumbled. "We just want what's fair." "Fair," I repeated, tasting the word like it was something foreign. "That's an interesting choice of words, Tim. Do you think it's fair to waltz into my house and try to take what my father worked his entire life to build?" He opened his mouth to respond, but Amanda cut him off. "Fair is the law," she snapped. "You're clinging to something that doesn't belong to you anymore. It's time to face reality." I smiled at her, a calm, deliberate smile that seemed to throw her off balance. "You're right," I said. "It is time to face reality." Just then, there was a knock at the door. Amanda and Tim both turned to look, their expressions shifting slightly. "Oh, perfect timing," I said, stepping past them to answer it. "That must be my lawyer." The door swung open, and in walked Claire, my lawyer and one of the sharpest legal minds I'd ever met. Her tailored suit and no-nonsense demeanor were enough to make anyone think twice about crossing her. She scanned the room quickly, her sharp gaze settling on Amanda and Tim. "So," Claire said, setting her briefcase down on the coffee table, "these are the people I've heard so much about." Amanda straightened up, her smug confidence faltering for the first time. "And who are you?" she demanded, her tone defensive. "I'm Claire," she said smoothly, extending a hand that Amanda didn't take. "I represent the rightful owner of this estate, and I'd love to hear more about your so-called claim." The room fell silent as Amanda glared at me, then at Claire. Tim looked like he wanted to disappear into the couch. "We've already spoken to a lawyer," Amanda said finally, though her voice lacked the conviction it had before. Claire raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? Then you'll have no problem sharing the details of your case with me. Go ahead. I'm all ears." Amanda hesitated, glancing at Tim, who seemed to shrink under her gaze. "We don't have the paperwork with us," she said finally. "But it's clear-cut. Any inheritance received during their marriage is community property. It's basic legal knowledge." Claire smiled, a cool, professional smile that sent a shiver of satisfaction down my spine. "I see," she said. "Well, it's a good thing I brought the actual documents with me. Shall we take a look at the facts?" Amanda's confidence crumbled further as Claire opened her briefcase and began laying out the paperwork on the table. The atmosphere shifted, the balance of power tipping unmistakably in my favor. "Let's begin, shall we?" Claire said, her tone calm but commanding. Amanda looked like she wanted to bolt, but she stayed seated, her face pale as the trap I'd set began to spring shut. Amanda was mid-sentence, her tone dripping with entitlement, when the knock at the door interrupted her tirade. The timing couldn't have been better. I straightened up from where I'd been leaning against the doorway, shooting Amanda a smile so calm it visibly rattled her. "Oh, that must be my lawyer," I said, my voice light and casual. Amanda's confident demeanor faltered just enough to satisfy me. Tim, meanwhile, looked even more uncomfortable, his eyes darting between Amanda and the door as if he were silently debating whether to make a run for it. When I opened the door, Claire stepped inside, exuding an air of authority that filled the room instantly. Her tailored navy suit was immaculate, and her sharp gaze swept over Amanda and Tim, taking their measure in an instant. She set her leather briefcase on the coffee table and smiled, tight and professional, with just a hint of challenge. "Ah," Claire said, her voice crisp and polished. "You must be the ones causing all this unnecessary drama." Amanda stiffened, her smirk flickering. "We're not causing drama," she said defensively. "We're here to claim what's legally ours. This isn't personal. It's about what's fair." Claire raised an eyebrow, the corners of her mouth twitching as if she were suppressing a laugh. "Fair, is it?" she said, her tone carefully neutral. "I'd love to see the documentation that supports your claim." Amanda hesitated, glancing at Tim for backup. When none came, she cleared her throat and said, "We don't have the paperwork with us, but our lawyer assured us we're well within our rights. This is community property, after all." Claire opened her briefcase with deliberate precision, pulling out a neat stack of documents. "Let me stop you right there," she said. "This is the last will and testament of my client's father, clearly stating that the entirety of his estate is to go to his daughter. There are no provisions for Mr. Tim or, by extension, yourself." Amanda's smirk vanished completely, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. "That doesn't negate the fact that she was married to Tim when her father died," she said, her voice growing sharper. "That makes it community property. It's basic law." "Basic law," Claire repeated, her tone light but pointed. She picked up another document from her pile and slid it across the table. "This is the divorce decree between my client and Mr. Tim, finalized well before her father's passing. All property and assets were divided at the time, leaving no legal connection between them. That negates any claims of community property. Perhaps your lawyer missed that detail." Amanda's face turned an impressive shade of red. This has to be a mistake," she stammered. "There's no way she gets everything." "Actually, there is," Claire said calmly. "And if you'd like to continue this discussion, I'd be happy to arrange a meeting with your lawyer to clarify things further. However, I must warn you that filing frivolous claims can lead to legal repercussions. Are you sure you want to proceed?" Tim finally found his voice, though it was barely above a whisper. "Amanda, maybe we should drop this," he said, his words tumbling out quickly. "I mean, if the papers are all in order." Amanda rounded on him, her eyes blazing. "Drop this? Are you serious? After everything we talked about?" Tim flinched under her glare, but didn't say anything else. Claire turned her attention back to Amanda, her expression unwavering. "I'd suggest you take Mr. Tim's advice," she said. "You're not going to win this. And the longer you drag it out, the more costly it will become for you. My client has no intention of giving up what rightfully belongs to her." I leaned back against the armrest of the couch, watching the exchange with quiet satisfaction. Amanda's bravado had crumbled completely, and even Tim looked like he was regretting every decision that had led him to this moment. After a long silence, Amanda finally stood, grabbing her purse with a jerky motion. "This isn't over," she spat, her voice venomous. "You'll be hearing from us again." Claire didn't flinch. "I'll look forward to it," she said coolly. Amanda stormed out of the house, her heels clicking furiously against the floor. Tim followed after her, pausing just long enough to glance at me with something that looked like guilt before he disappeared through the door. When they were gone, Claire turned to me, her expression softening. "Well, that was fun," she said dryly. I laughed, the tension draining from my shoulders. "You handled that beautifully," I said. Claire smiled. "That's what you pay me for. But don't relax just yet. Something tells me they're not going to give up that easily." She was right, of course. Amanda wasn't the type to back down without a fight. But as I watched their car pull out of my driveway, I felt a sense of calm I hadn't felt in weeks. For the first time since my father's passing, I was confident that his legacy and my home were safe. The room felt suffocatingly silent after Amanda's outburst. Her words, "our lawyer assured us," hung in the air, sounding flimsier by the second. I could see the cracks forming in her confidence. Her smirk was gone, replaced by a tense, forced calm. She glanced at Tim, probably hoping for backup, but he looked like he'd rather meld into the floor than meet her gaze. Claire, on the other hand, didn't so much as blink. Her calm, measured demeanor only made Amanda's bluster seem more ridiculous. "There's no need to involve third parties," Claire said smoothly, lifting her briefcase onto the table. "I brought the official documents with me. She snapped open the locks and pulled out a thick folder, laying it on the coffee table with an air of finality. This, Claire continued, flipping to the first page and sliding it toward Amanda, is the last will and testament of my client's father. You'll notice it's dated and notarized, leaving no room for ambiguity. As you can see, he left the entirety of his estate, this home, the land, his savings, and other assets to his daughter. There are no provisions, clauses, or allowances for Mr. Tim or anyone connected to him. Amanda's face flushed an impressive shade of red, and for a moment, I thought steam might actually come out of her ears. This is outrageous, she sputtered, snatching the paper off the table as if she could will it to say something different. Her eyes darted over the text, her lips moving as she read, but her frown deepened with every line. There must be some kind of mistake, she said finally, throwing the paper back onto the table like it burned her. Our lawyer was very clear. Tim has a claim through community property. That supersedes the will. Claire raised an eyebrow and calmly adjusted her glasses, a move so precise it felt like an executioner sharpening their blade. There's no mistake, she said firmly. First, the notion of community property is irrelevant here. As I mentioned earlier, the divorce decree between my client and Mr. Tim was finalized well before her father's passing. There's no legal tether between them that would entitle him, or you, to any part of this estate. Amanda opened her mouth to argue, but Claire held up a hand to stop her. Second, Claire continued, her tone unwavering. Even if we entertained the fantasy that Tim had a claim, my client took proactive steps to protect her inheritance. We filed a series of post-divorce amendments to ensure that her father's estate would remain legally separate from any previous marital ties. She pulled out another document, neatly stapled and full of legal jargon. This is a court-approved filing that explicitly safeguards the will. Any challenge to its validity would be seen as frivolous and likely dismissed outright. Amanda's sputtering frustration was almost comical. This can't be right, she said weakly. There's no way she gets everything. Tim deserves something. He was married to her, after all. I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms as I watched her unravel. He was married to me, I said calmly. Past tense. And even if he hadn't been my ex, my father made his intentions crystal clear. He wanted his estate to stay in the family, his family, not an opportunistic ex-son-in-law or his entitled new wife. Tim flinched at my words, but didn't try to defend himself. He looked smaller than I remembered, hunched and worn down. I almost felt sorry for him, but then I thought about how he'd let Amanda march into my home and spew this nonsense. And whatever pity I felt quickly evaporated. I think we're done here, Claire said, her voice cutting through the tension. Unless you'd like to continue embarrassing yourselves. Amanda glared at her, then at me. This isn't over, she said through gritted teeth. We'll find a way. We'll fight this. By all means, Claire said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. But I'd advise you to reconsider. Filing baseless claims in court is not only expensive, but can also lead to sanctions against the plaintiff. Do you really want to go down that road? Amanda's lips pressed into a thin line, her hands clutching her purse so tightly her knuckles turned white. Let's go, Tim, she snapped, her voice full of barely contained fury. Tim rose slowly, hesitating for a moment as if he wanted to say something. But Amanda grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the door before he could open his mouth. As the door slammed shut behind them, I let out a long breath, the adrenaline leaving my body all at once. Claire started gathering her papers, her expression calm and businesslike. Well, she said, glancing at me with a wry smile. That was fun. Fun isn't the word I'd use, I replied, though I couldn't help but smile back. But thank you. I couldn't have handled that without you. Happy to help, Claire said, sliding the documents back into her briefcase. But don't let your guard down just yet. Something tells me Amanda isn't the type to go quietly. I nodded, knowing she was right. Amanda wasn't done, not by a long shot. But for now, at least, I had the satisfaction of knowing my father's will was ironclad, and Amanda's plan had been thoroughly dismantled. As Claire left and the house fell silent, I sat down on the couch, letting the relief wash over me. Whatever Amanda tried next, I was ready. I had Claire on my side, and more importantly, I had the truth. The door had barely clicked shut behind Amanda and Tim when I heard muffled voices arguing just outside. I peeked through the window and saw Amanda gesturing wildly, her face twisted in anger, while Tim stood there with slumped shoulders, looking every bit the coward I remembered. The sight stirred a mix of emotions in me, disgust, vindication, and an aching frustration that I'd ever trusted him. As the minutes dragged on, The argument seemed to reach a boiling point. Amanda stomped back toward the house, yanking the door open without bothering to knock. Her face was flushed with fury, but before she could launch into another tirade, Tim followed her in, his expression bleak. "Amanda, maybe we should drop this," he said, his voice low and defeated. It was the first time he'd spoken up with anything resembling conviction, but Amanda was having none of it. "Drop this?" she hissed, spinning around to face him. "After everything we talked about? After everything you said?" Her words piqued my curiosity, and I leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "What exactly did you say, Tim?" I asked, my tone cold enough to make him flinch. He hesitated, his gaze darting between me and Amanda, as if searching for an escape. When none came, he sighed, running a hand through his hair. I thought maybe I had a shot at the estate," he admitted reluctantly. "Amanda pushed me to look into it, and I went along with it. But I didn't think it would come to this." For a moment, the room was silent, save for the faint hum of the heater. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. I could feel my anger bubbling to the surface, but I forced myself to stay calm. "You thought you'd take advantage of my father's death to make a quick buck?" I said evenly, though my voice shook just slightly at the end. Tim winced but didn't deny it. "I wasn't trying to take everything," he mumbled, still avoiding my gaze. "I just thought, after the divorce, maybe I deserved something. Amanda said it wasn't fair that you got everything, and I guess I let her get in my head." I let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Fair? You thought this was about fairness?" "Tim, my father worked his entire life to build what he left behind. He was generous to a fault, but do you know what he couldn't stand? Greed. That's why his will was crystal clear. He wanted everything to stay in the family. Not with you, and certainly not with her." I pointed toward Amanda, whose expression was darkening with every word. "She didn't make me do this," Tim said quickly, though his voice lacked conviction. "I mean, she brought it up, but I made the choice to go along with it. This is on me." I stared at him, searching his face for any sign of the man I used to love. But all I saw was weakness and regret, two things that seemed to define him more and more with each passing moment. Amanda, who had been unusually quiet up until now, exploded. "You're pathetic," she spat at Tim, her voice full of venom. "You said this was a sure thing. You said we had a right to it. And now you're just rolling over?" "I didn't think it would get this far," Tim muttered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't think she'd bring a lawyer into it." Amanda turned on him fully, her anger spilling over. "Of course, she brought a lawyer. She's not stupid. But you couldn't even stick to the plan for 5 minutes." Claire, who had been observing the exchange with a mixture of amusement and disdain, finally spoke up. "I think that's enough," she said, her tone cutting through the tension like a knife. "It's clear there's no basis for your claim, and the longer you stay here, the more ridiculous this gets." Amanda glared at her, but seemed to realize she had no ground left to stand on. She turned to me one last time, her eyes narrowing. "You're going to regret this," she said, her voice low and threatening. I raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "The only thing I regret is ever letting Tim into my life in the first place," I said coolly. Her jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought she might say something else. But instead, she grabbed him by the arm and dragged him toward the door. "We're leaving," she snapped, her heels clicking angrily against the floor. Tim glanced back at me as they left, his face full of shame. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, but I didn't respond. When the door slammed shut behind them, I turned to Claire, who was already packing up her briefcase. "Well," she said, smirking slightly. "That was eventful." I sank into the couch, exhaustion washing over me. "Eventful doesn't even begin to cover it," I muttered. Claire gave me a shoulder. "You handled it well," she said. "But don't let your guard down. Something tells me they're not done yet." I nodded, knowing she was right. Amanda wasn't the type to back down without a fight, and Tim was too spineless to stand up to her. But for now, at least I had the upper hand, and I was determined to keep it. Whatever they tried next, I'd be ready. The tension in the room was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. Amanda, red-faced and seething, was far from ready to back down. She whirled on Tim, her eyes blazing with fury. "You're pathetic," she snapped, her voice cracking with frustration. "You said this was a sure thing. You promised me we deserve this." Tim shrank back, mumbling something incomprehensible, but Amanda wasn't interested in his excuses. She turned her venomous gaze back to me, her hands clenched into fists. "You don't deserve any of this," she spat. "You're selfish, and you don't know how to share. This isn't just about you. Tim was a part of your life, and that gives us a claim. I stayed silent, my arms crossed as I let her words hang in the air. Amanda wanted a reaction, a fight, but I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction. My silence seemed to infuriate her even more, and she took a step closer, her voice rising. Do you even hear yourself? Hoarding all of this when you could easily share it. You don't need all this land, this house, this money. Claire, who had been silently observing the meltdown, finally stood up. Her expression was calm, her tone authoritative as she addressed Amanda. I think we're done here, she said, her voice cutting through Amanda's rant like a blade. Amanda froze, her jaw tightening. She looked like she wanted to argue, but Claire's no-nonsense demeanor left little room for negotiation. Unless, Claire added, you'd like to embarrass yourselves further? Amanda's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes darting between me and Claire. For a moment, I thought she might try to say something else, but instead, she took a deep, shaky breath and turned toward the door. Let's go, she snapped at Tim, not even bothering to look at him. Tim hesitated, glancing at me one last time. His expression was a mix of shame and regret, but he didn't say anything. He simply followed Amanda as she stormed out of the house, her heels clicking furiously against the floor. At the door, Amanda paused, looking over her shoulder. This isn't over, she hissed, her voice low and full of anger. I smiled faintly, unbothered by the hollow threat. Goodbye, Amanda, I said calmly. She glared at me for a moment longer before slamming the door behind her. The house fell silent, the only sound the faint hum of the heater in the background. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could finally breathe again. Claire walked over to me, her briefcase in hand, and gave me a reassuring smile. Well, that was something, she said dryly. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding and sank into the couch. That's one way to put it, I replied, shaking my head. Claire sat down beside me, setting her briefcase on the floor. You handled that beautifully, she said. But I wouldn't get too comfortable. Amanda strikes me as the type who doesn't let things go easily. You think she'll try something else? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Probably, Claire said, leaning back in her chair. But we've got everything on our side. The law, the paperwork, and the truth. Whatever she tries, we'll be ready. Her words were comforting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Amanda wasn't done stirring up trouble. She wasn't just angry, she was entitled. And entitlement had a way of fueling irrational decisions. Still, for the first time since my father's passing, I felt a sense of closure. Amanda's threats, Tim's regret, even the exhausting confrontation we'd just endured. It all seemed so small compared to the peace I felt knowing my father's legacy was secure. Thank you, Claire, I said sincerely, meeting her gaze. I don't know what I would have done without you. Claire smiled. That's what I'm here for. Now, go pour yourself a glass of wine or take a long bath. You've earned it. As she packed up her things and left, I sat there for a long moment, staring at the door Amanda had slammed on her way out. I knew this wasn't the end of her schemes, but for now, the house felt quiet, safe, and mine. And that was enough. After Amanda and Tim stormed out, the house felt eerily quiet, as though it was exhaling after all the tension. I let out a long breath, slumping into the couch while Claire calmly packed up her documents. She moved with a practiced efficiency that made it clear she'd dealt with people like Amanda before. Don't let them get to you, Claire said, sliding a folder into her briefcase. They've got nothing. This case is airtight, and any lawyer worth their salt will tell them the same thing. I nodded, still replaying Amanda's venomous words in my head. Do you think she'll actually try to pursue it? I asked. Claire gave me a knowing look. People like her usually can't resist, she said. She's got too much pride to admit she's wrong. But don't worry, we've got everything in place. If they try to make a move, they'll lose, and it'll cost them. Her confidence was reassuring, but I couldn't shake the lingering unease. Amanda had already proven she wasn't above manipulation and intimidation, and I doubted she'd give up just because the law wasn't on her side. In the weeks that followed, I took Claire's advice and worked to fortify my position. I updated my own will, ensuring that my assets would be protected in case anything happened to me. It felt strange and a little morbid, but it was a necessary step. Securing the deed to the house was another important task. My father had left it to me in his will, but transferring ownership to my name and ensuring everything was properly documented gave me an added layer of protection. It also gave me a sense of closure, like I was fully stepping into the role of caretaker for the home my father had loved so much. One of the most meaningful things I did during this time was start making plans to honor my father's legacy. He'd been a quiet but generous man who believed in giving back to the community. Inspired by that, I decided to create a small scholarship fund in his name, aimed at helping local students pursue their education. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it felt right. It felt like a way to channel all the pain and frustration of the past few months into something positive. Through all of this, I found myself reflecting on my father's life and the lessons he'd taught me. He had always been a firm believer in standing up for what was right, even when it wasn't easy. That belief had carried me through my divorce, through my grief, and now through Amanda's relentless greed. It wasn't just about protecting what was mine. It was about honoring his memory and ensuring that his hard work wasn't tarnished by people who didn't understand its value. Claire stayed in close contact during this time, checking in regularly to make sure everything was in order. She even reached out to Amanda and Tim's supposed lawyer to confirm that they hadn't filed any claims. As expected, there was no follow-through on their end. "They're all bark and no bite," Claire said during one of our phone calls. "But don't let that lull you into complacency. Amanda strikes me as the type who thrives on stirring up drama. So keep your guard up." I took her words to heart, keeping meticulous records and staying prepared for any potential surprises. At the same time, I tried to reclaim a sense of normalcy in my life. I focused on work, spent time with friends, and even started taking long walks around the property, appreciating its beauty in a way I hadn't before. It was during one of these walks that I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in months. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden light over the fields, and I could almost hear my father's voice in my mind, telling me to keep going, to keep fighting for what mattered. For the first time since his passing, I felt like I was honoring that advice. I wasn't just holding on to his legacy. I was building my own. As I headed back to the house, I saw Claire's car pulling into the driveway. She stepped out, holding a thick envelope. "Good news," she said, smiling. "The final paperwork is all set. This house and everything tied to it is officially and irrevocably yours." I took the envelope from her, a wave of relief washing over me. "Thank you," I said, my voice thick with emotion. Claire patted my shoulder. "You did most of the work," she said. "I just made sure it stuck." As I stood there, holding the proof of everything I'd fought for, I realized that the house wasn't just a building. It was a symbol of everything my father had stood for: integrity, resilience, and the importance of family. Amanda and Tim might try to come back, but I knew I was ready. I'd fortified not just my legal standing, but my resolve. No matter what they threw at me, I wasn't going to let them take what was mine. For now, though, I allowed myself a moment to enjoy the quiet victory. The house was mine. My father's legacy was safe. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was standing on solid ground. For a short time, after Amanda's dramatic exit from my house, there was a blissful silence. No calls, no emails, no surprise visits. I let myself believe, briefly, that she'd finally accepted the reality of the situation. But in hindsight, that was wishful thinking. Amanda wasn't the type to walk away quietly. Her comeback started with a bang. Literally. I woke up one morning to the sound of my mailbox slamming shut. Peering through the window, I caught a glimpse of Amanda's car speeding away, her distinctive vanity plates flashing in the early sunlight. Suspicious, I went outside to check and found a letter shoved into the box. The envelope was cheap, the kind you buy in bulk, and the handwriting was unmistakably Amanda's. Inside was a copy of a lawsuit she had filed, claiming Tim was entitled to half the estate under some flimsy interpretation of marital law. Her reasoning? Because we'd still been married during a portion of the time my father's estate was being finalized, Tim had a right to it. I stared at the paper in disbelief. It was absurd, almost laughably so, but also infuriating. Amanda's desperation was obvious, but that didn't make her antics any less exhausting. I called Claire immediately, reading the document aloud to her. Claire sighed on the other end of the line. "Classic Amanda," she said, the faintest hint of amusement in her tone. "This is as frivolous as it gets. I'll handle it." "What happens now?" I asked, pacing the living room. "Does this mean we have to go to court?" "Unlikely," Claire replied. "I'll file a motion to dismiss, and if the judge has any common sense, it'll be thrown out before it even gets a hearing. Don't worry. We've already laid the groundwork to make sure this doesn't go anywhere." True to her word, Claire worked swiftly. Within weeks, the case was dismissed without so much as a preliminary hearing. The judge's ruling was scathing, stating that Amanda's argument was baseless and an apparent attempt to harass me. But Amanda wasn't finished. The court's rejection only seemed to fuel her bitterness, and her behavior escalated in increasingly unhinged ways. She began leaving nasty notes in my mailbox, written in the same hurried scrawl as her lawsuit. The messages ranged from childish insults to vague threats, each one more desperate than the last. "She's spiraling," Claire said when I showed her the notes. "People like Amanda don't know when to quit. But the more she does this, the easier it'll be to prove she's harassing you." The harassment didn't stop with the notes. Amanda started showing up at my house unannounced, banging on the door and yelling accusations. One time, I opened the door just enough to tell her to leave, and she screamed, "You're a thief. You're stealing what's rightfully ours," before stomping back to her car. As if that wasn't enough, Amanda began spreading rumors about me around town. I heard from neighbors, co-workers, and even casual acquaintances that she was telling anyone who would listen that I was a liar, a manipulator, and even a cheater during my marriage to Tim. It was pathetic, really. A grown woman resorting to playground-level gossip to soothe her bruised ego. But it was also infuriating. Her lies were starting to damage my reputation, and I knew I couldn't let it go on. Eventually, I decided enough was enough. With Claire's guidance, I filed for a restraining order. It wasn't an easy decision. Taking legal action felt like pouring gasoline on an already smoldering fire. But I wasn't about to let Amanda turn my life into a circus. The court hearing for the restraining order was surprisingly straightforward. Claire presented the notes Amanda had left, along with a log of her visits and a handful of witness statements from neighbors who'd seen her causing a scene. Amanda, true to form, tried to turn the hearing into a spectacle, interrupting and accusing me of lying. The judge wasn't having it. He granted the restraining order without hesitation, barring Amanda from coming within 100 feet of my property or contacting me in any way. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Amanda had spent months trying to undermine me, but now she was legally bound to leave me alone. "That should keep her off your back," Claire said as we left the courthouse. "But if she steps out of line again, we'll have everything we need to take further action." "Thanks, Claire," I said, my gratitude sincere. "I don't know how I would have gotten through this without you." She smiled. "That's what I'm here for. And don't worry, you're stronger than you think." Amanda might not see it yet, but she's already lost. As I drove home that day, I couldn't help but feel a flicker of pity for Amanda. Her desperation and bitterness had consumed her, leaving her with nothing but empty threats and burned bridges. But that pity didn't outweigh my relief. I'd fought hard to protect my father's legacy, and now it felt like I could finally move on. Whatever Amanda tried next, if she tried anything at all, I knew I was ready. I wasn't just defending what was mine anymore. I was building something stronger, something that no amount of greed or entitlement could touch. The call from Tim came out of the blue, months after the restraining order against Amanda had been granted and the lawsuit she'd filed had been laughed out of court. I almost didn't pick up when I saw his name on the screen, but curiosity got the better of me. "Hello," I said cautiously, unsure what to expect. "Hey," Tim said, his voice hesitant. "It's me. I know this is unexpected, but I want to talk." I stayed silent for a moment, waiting for him to continue. When he didn't, I sighed. "What do you want, Tim?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. I need to apologize," he said, the words rushing out in a flood. "For everything. For the lawsuit. For showing up at your house. For letting Amanda drag me into all of it. I was wrong, and I'm sorry for everything I put you through." I wasn't sure what to say. For months, I'd been dealing with the fallout of Amanda's schemes, and while she had been the ringleader, Tim hadn't been an innocent bystander. He'd gone along with her, enabled her, and stood by as she tried to dismantle my life. "You let her push you into this," I said finally, my voice steady but cold. "Why, Tim? Why did you let her manipulate you like that?" There was a long pause before he answered. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice heavy with guilt. I think I was bitter after the divorce. When Amanda started talking about how unfair it was that you got everything, it fed into that bitterness. I convinced myself that I had a right to it, even though deep down, I knew I didn't. "That doesn't excuse what you did," I said firmly. "I know," he said quickly. "And I'm not trying to make excuses. I wanted you to know that I'm sorry. For all of it. I wish I could take it back, but I can't. All I can do is apologize and try to make things right." His sincerity caught me off guard. For the first time in years, Tim sounded like the man I had once loved, the man I had married. It was disarming, but I wasn't ready to forgive him. Not yet. "I appreciate the apology," I said after a long pause. "But you have to understand that it's going to take time. You put me through a lot, and I can't just forget that." "I get it," Tim said. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I wanted you to know that I'm trying to be better." Over the next few months, Tim made an effort to rebuild trust. He didn't try to force his way back into my life, but he reached out occasionally to check in or apologize again. His messages were always measured, never pushy, and over time, I began to believe that he was genuinely remorseful. Eventually, I agreed to meet him for coffee. It was awkward at first, but as we talked, I saw glimpses of the person I had fallen for all those years ago. He admitted that his relationship with Amanda was on the rocks, and that he was starting to realize how toxic she was. "I should have listened to you," he said, stirring his coffee absently. "You were right about her. She brought out the worst in me." "I think you brought out the worst in each other," I said honestly. He winced but nodded. "Yeah, you're probably right." While I wasn't ready to call Tim a friend, I appreciated his efforts to make amends. We started communicating more frequently, though I made it clear that our interactions would be strictly platonic. "There are boundaries, Tim," I told him one day. "I'm willing to rebuild some trust, but I need you to respect that." "Of course," he said. "I wouldn't expect anything else." Slowly, cautiously, we began to form a new kind of relationship, one based on mutual respect and an understanding of the mistakes we'd both made in the past. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when I wondered if I was being too lenient. But in the end, I decided that holding on to anger wasn't worth it. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, and it certainly didn't mean letting Tim back into my life fully. But it did mean letting go of the resentment that had been weighing me down. As we parted ways after one of our coffee meetups, Tim paused and turned to me. "Thank you," he said, "for giving me a chance to make things right." I nodded, offering him a small smile. "Just don't waste it," I said. Walking away, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't expected. Tim's apology didn't erase the past, but it was a step toward healing. And for the first time in years, I felt like we were both finally moving forward. In the quiet months that followed, I found myself reflecting often on everything that had happened. From Amanda's relentless schemes to Tim's eventual apology, the whole ordeal had been exhausting, frustrating, and deeply revealing. It wasn't just about protecting my father's legacy. It was about rediscovering my own strength and learning to stand firm in the face of manipulation and greed. Amanda's attempts to upend my life slowly faded into the background. After the restraining order was granted and the lawsuit was dismissed, her influence dwindled. People in town stopped listening to her gossip, especially once Claire helped me share my side of the story with a few well-placed facts. It became clear to everyone that Amanda's claims had been baseless and that her vindictive behavior said more about her character than mine. She didn't give up immediately, of course. There were a few half-hearted attempts to stir up drama. A snide comment to a mutual acquaintance here, a passive-aggressive social media post there. But they fizzled out when they didn't get the reaction she wanted. By the end, Amanda was a non-factor in my life, and I felt a deep sense of relief knowing she no longer had the power to affect me. Tim, too, had moved on. While I couldn't say we were close, we maintained a cautious friendship built on mutual understanding. His apology had been a turning point, and while I didn't fully trust him, I appreciated his efforts to make amends. He eventually filed for divorce from Amanda, citing irreconcilable differences, a decision I could hardly blame him for. In our sporadic conversations, Tim admitted that the experience had been a wake-up call for him. "I lost myself for a while," he said during one of our coffee meetups. "I let Amanda's ambition cloud my judgment. But I'm trying to be better now." Hearing those words felt like a small victory, not just for me, but for the version of Tim I had once loved. He was taking responsibility for his actions, something he hadn't been able to do during our marriage. It didn't change the past, but it gave me hope for his future, and I wished him well as he rebuilt his life. As for me, I threw myself into creating a life that honored my father's memory. The scholarship fund I'd started in his name grew faster than I'd expected, thanks to donations from local businesses and former students who had been touched by his generosity. Each time I awarded a scholarship to a deserving student, I felt a sense of pride and fulfillment, knowing my father's legacy was making a tangible difference. The house, too, became a source of comfort and inspiration. I spent weekends tending to the garden my father had loved, planting new flowers and vegetables that he would have appreciated. Inside, I made small but meaningful changes, blending his timeless style with touches of my own. One of my favorite additions was a photo wall in the hallway, filled with pictures of my father throughout his life, smiling with his students, working on the house, laughing at family gatherings. It was a constant reminder of the man he was and the values he'd instilled in me: kindness, perseverance, and the importance of standing up for what was right. The new chapter of my life wasn't without its challenges, but it was mine. I learned to trust myself again, to set boundaries, and to let go of the anger that had weighed me down for so long. Each step forward felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that I'd lost in the chaos of the past few years. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, I stood on the porch of my home and let the quiet wash over me. The weight of the past, the fights, the betrayals, the fear of losing everything, felt distant now, like a bad dream I'd finally woken up from. In that moment, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced in years. The house, the land, my father's legacy, they were all safe. But more importantly, so was I. Sometimes justice really does win. And when it does, it's not just about the victory. It's about the freedom that comes with it. The chance to start fresh, to build something stronger, to move forward with hope and purpose. As I watched the last rays of sunlight fade, I smiled, knowing that I was exactly where I was meant to be.